What up, y'all? Your boys are back. I got my shirt back on. It's tucked in. We're here for this week's narrative. All right, this week's narrative. Old players are undervalued in Dynasty. And where this is stemming from is coming from at Luke. I can't even pronounce his last name. We'll throw it up on the screen. I think it's Neondorf. Sounds like he's definitely from Hogwarts School of the Arts, but really cool dude on Twitter. Make sure you guys follow him. He's an analytics dude, puts out a ton of great content on the number side. But he basically did a study this week on how players age, and we'll throw it up on the screen for you. But basically, the common narrative in Dynasty is that running backs fall off after 5 years. We say it ourselves. Wide receiver fall off, when they hit like age 28 or whatever. And look, that's not necessarily true. And he really looks into the numbers, and you can see basically running backs actually produce well into basically their year 9. And then same thing with wide receivers. They produce well into like year, like maybe even 13, like year 12 and 13. And although the numbers say that, I just want to give the numbers some context, right? What's happening is like not very many people in the NFL play until year 10 or year 13 or year 14 or whatever. It's really the elite guys that actually get there. So it's like the Julio Jones that get there. It's like the Marshall Falks, the LaDainian Tomlinsons, the Adrian Petersons. So what you have is a little bit of a survivorship bias because the good players are the ones that last. So obviously in those later years, they'll make up of a greater proportion of the total sample size, which means that there'll be more RB1, wide receiver 1 finishes, et cetera, et cetera. So although I think I agree with like the overall concept that like old players are undervalued because they always will be, what I think is being missed there is a little bit of the survivorship bias. But what's more important is I put up a follow-up tweet to this, and we'll throw it up on the screen. And I want people to really understand the difference between a production cliff and a value cliff. So a production cliff is when the production for a player just falls off, right? And that's like when you're basically no longer fantasy viable. Whereas a value cliff is when your ADP, your trade value, whatever value like indicator you want to use, that falls off. And those two things are different. They're very different. And for elite players, the production cliff usually comes much later than the value cliff. And that's what Luke's tweet really shows you, is that if you're an elite player, like even though the value has dropped off, you're still producing at an elite level. And why is that important, right? It's important because you need to understand where your team is. Are you a rebuilder, or are you a true contender? And when I say contender, I'm not talking about like someone that sneaks in the playoffs and, one of those guys like, hey, as long as I get in, I have a chance. Like, don't be that dude, because that is how you fucking suck at Dynasty for a really long time. You want to be like a top 2 or 3 team. Like you are like basically a lock for playoffs and really pushing for the championship. If you are not that, you should be really focused on value cliffs, because even if a player produces, it's not going to matter for you if you're not competing. So, it's about looking, people always talk about Julio Jones, right? Julio Jones, he passed the value cliff a long time ago. As soon as he hit probably age 27, age 28, his value took a nosedive. And it's going to happen to guys like Nuke. You kind of already see it. It's going to happen to guys like Devontae Adams. It's going to happen to guys like OBJ. It's going to happen to Michael Thomas. And if you're in a rebuild, it's really important for you to identify when that value cliff is going to happen. And for wide receivers, it's usually around age 28. For some reason, people just like, they think it's a plague because 28 is the new 30. And for running backs, it's basically age 25. So you need to identify your team. Think about how long it's going to take you to rebuild. And if that value cliff hits before your rebuild is complete, you need to sell that player. And that's why I think you need to focus on the value cliff of rebuilding. But if you're a contender, it's the total opposite. You want to find players that are past their value cliff, but still have not hit their production cliff. And that's where guys like Keenan Allen really come into play. And that's when you'll be buying guys like Devontae Adams, Michael Thomas, when they're in like 28, 29 years old, and they're going to produce at an elite level for another 3 to 4 years. You want to buy those guys to fill out your team. And that's what my tweet was really about. It's like when you're rebuilding, you want to identify the value cliff, get out ASAP. And if you are contending, you want to buy players in the gap between the value cliff and the production cliff. So I know I just had a freaking soliloquy here. So I want to pass off Noah because I really want to get your thoughts. Like, what do you think about age, and how do you approach that in your dynasty leagues?
Yeah, that was, as people in Good Will Hunting would say, that was wicked smart.
My boy's wicked smart.
But like if you're a rebuilding team, I completely agree. If you are rebuilding and you have even a Mike Evans type, might as well sell him now, because if you wait till next year, like he'll probably put up another 1,000, 1,200 yards, whatever. But if you are a clear rebuilding team and you start to sell him off next year, what are your league mates going to think? They're going to think you're desperate to sell them off. And the value cliff is going to be even greater because people are going to be fielding less valuable offers for your side, whatever you can get in return, because they know you want him off of your team. Me personally, I try to keep my teams in a contending shape, so I will be buying guys like Devonta Adams and DeAndre Hopkins because I believe in the talent. But that doesn't mean I'm going to overpay for them, because I do understand, like Mike was saying, that's a great point. Like DeAndre Hopkins right now is probably going to produce for the next 4 or 5 seasons. I wouldn't be surprised if for the next 3 seasons he's a wide receiver 1, and 2 following that he's like a high-end wide receiver 2. The thing is, and I think it has a lot to do with Twitter and just how many people in Dynasty think, is like once you do hit 28, 29 years old, people start to realize, oh, well, next year and start of draft season be half a round later and half a round later and half a round later. And if I'm not going to be competing, why would I want to buy into a guy like that? So although their value does get decreased a little bit, I think that does give you a good opportunity to buy if you are a competing team, but it also gives the opportunity for redraft teams to try to get out ahead of things and sell before this cliff happens. And we'll link the tweet in the description so you guys can really look at things. And I know we talked about it in a previous narrative, like sell your running backs once they hit 25, but we saw Marshall Faulk produce when he was like 29 and all that stuff. Mike is right again. Like the good players
Survivorship bias.
Survivorship bias. Like obviously a guy like Todd Gurley, you want to sell probably last year because you know he doesn't have much time left in the NFL, or Melvin Gordon or Le'Veon Bell, right? They are lasting this long in the league, but they are starting to deteriorate fast. So although there is survivorship bias there, you kind of understand when to sell these guys because you start to see a downward trend. Try to sell guys a year or two before they start to fall down this cliff. And I know it's not easy to say sell Ezekiel Elliott, but realistically, he's probably like 1 or 2 years away from being in that same pool of like a Todd Gurley or a Le'Veon Bell, where nobody's buying him anymore because he's 26, 27 years old on the back half of his contract and probably be cut for not too much money lost. So it is hard. It is very hard to part ways with players, especially if you're a fringe playoff team, to part ways with a Devontae Adams or a DeAndre Hopkins or an Ezekiel Elliott or an Alvin Kamara, because you do think that they're the pieces that are going to take you over the top. But if that's the only piece you have on your team, the chance of you winning your playoffs and winning out and winning the championship are extremely low. Might as well just get a bunch of assets in return and try to rebuild through that way.
Yeah, and the other thing that people don't talk about enough is like that production. Not only is it not only do you get nothing from it, it actually really hurts you, because what happens is you score more points, you potentially get a higher draft pick instead of a lower draft pick. Like converting players into picks and production into draft picks is the best way to tank, and it's a legitimate way to tank, right? You want to take those points off your team. So like if you really need to assess yourself, and the common mistake I see people make is like they think that you have to be a trash team to be in a rebuild. That's not the case. If you're running Dynasty appropriately, the second that you realize you're not a true contender, you should be entering a rebuild. So it doesn't mean your team is bad. It just means that you took a look across your league, and maybe there's like a couple of juggernauts who you think are going to really dominate in the next couple of years. It's time to really pivot. And I have a couple of leagues like that where like my team isn't necessarily bad. I'll probably be a playoff team every year, right? But I'm not going to compete or really, really contend unless I get really, really lucky. So what I do is I'll tear those teams down and enter a rebuild. So you really want to get those points off your team and get them into your bench or get them into draft picks. And a couple of the names I'll add, you had a couple good ones like Zeke, but if you take a look at your team and you're on a 2-year rebuild, Nick Chubb needs to go, right? Nick Chubb needs to go. Joe Mixon needs to go. We love these players, but they need to go. And, Alvin Kamara needs to go. You mentioned him, right? These are the types of players where their value is still really high right now, and you really
Derrick
want to
Henry
capitalize.
too. I'll throw him out there. I know we're always saying to sell, but he just signed that 4-year deal. Just sell him now, because the chances of his value increasing in 2 years from now is extremely low.
Yeah, he's got a top 2-round startup pick, and like if you're not a contender or if you're not a true contender, like you should not have Derrick Henry on your teams, because I will almost guarantee you that Derrick Henry's ADP will not be higher than it is today. Like even if he goes out and has another rushing title, it's not going to happen. I promise you that. So
nobody's buying a 27-year-old running back at that point in the first round.
All right. Hope you guys enjoyed. Hope you guys found that helpful, this week's narrative. We'll be back at you soon with more videos. So make sure you stay tuned, subscribe to the channel, cop the guide, become a Patreon, join Discord leagues if you want to. Honestly, a lot of good value in there. And as always, if you have improvements, questions, whatever, drop a comment below and we'll get back at you.
Peace.